Bugatti want £20,000 to service my Bugatti Veyron.
All the prices you hear about Bugatti service and so on, it's rumors, it's not the truth.
A misfire causing the engine light to come on, and we still have that transmission fault.
Matt Armstrong owns 2 Bugattis, and the internet only seems to care about one of them. His crashed Chiron Pur Sport made headlines, pulled in Bugatti's CEO.
According to the CEO of Bugatti, there's only 2 places in the world that are able to repair a crashed Bugatti, and only special technicians that are able to actually disassemble the vehicle.
And turned into a viral standoff over parts and pride. But quietly, his second Bugatti, a repossessed Veyron, was living through something far stranger. A $3 fuse fix unraveled into a documented factory recall that failed even after it was supposedly fixed. Bugatti's sales line called him back within minutes. Their service line never picked up at all. The final bill came to a staggering $59,000 for a problem the manufacturer already knew about. Let's discuss these things in the video. The repossessed Bugatti's first surprise. When a repossession company takes back a Bugatti Veyron, it does not advertise the fact quietly. These are cars built in numbers so small, 450 in total, ever, that losing one to a bank rarely stays a secret for long. The Veyron was never meant to be a car people simply drove and traded like any other. It was Volkswagen Group's answer to a question nobody had asked. What happens if you build a road car with no compromises at all? No regard for cost, purely to prove it could be done. Production ran for roughly a decade, and every single one that rolled out of the Molsheim factory arrived already a piece of automotive history. Earlier this year, Matt Armstrong bought one of these repossessed Veyrons for what he described only as a significantly lower price than the $2 million a clean example commands. Nobody outside his team knows the real number. What everyone eventually learned was the state of the car underneath the paint. The exterior looked mint. The interior looked untouched. The engine, remarkably, started on the first attempt. A small miracle for a 16-cylinder, quad-turbocharged machine that had clearly sat neglected for longer than anyone wanted to admit. For a moment, it must have felt like the deal of a lifetime. A repossessed hypercar that looked, on the surface, like it needed nothing more than a wash and a full tank of fuel. That feeling did not last. A Bugatti Veyron does not reveal its wounds at a glance. It hides them in the transmission, in the wiring looms, in systems so specialized that most independent garages would not know where to begin. And a car that sits idle for long stretches tends to develop exactly the kind of hidden faults that only reveal themselves under load. The first time someone actually tries to drive it like it was built to be driven. The first wound Armstrong found was the worst kind, invisible until you tried to drive. The gearbox would not engage a single gear. The car was, in the most literal sense, stuck in park. A $2 million hypercar reduced to an ornament in a driveway. Armstrong's team ran diagnostics and came back with a number that would make most car owners sit down, somewhere between $350,000 and $400,000 to replace the gearbox outright. For context, that is not the price of a nice house in most of the country. That is the price of several. Bugatti's engineering, whatever else can be said about it, does not build in cheap fixes.
Bugatti Veyrons are expensive to maintain.
£20,000 service is 18,000 plus VAT.
37,800.
About $25,000.
Yeah, very, very spicy.
Every component in the transmission is bespoke, low volume, and priced accordingly. So when Armstrong's team began tracing the fault, instead of simply accepting the quote, what they found was almost comedic in its simplicity. The gearbox was not shifting because a single fuse, a component you could buy at nearly any hardware store on the planet, had blown. Armstrong drove to Halford's, the British equivalent of a big box auto parts store, and bought a replacement fuse for a handful of pounds. He installed it himself. The car shifted into gear on the first try. A repair quoted at hundreds of thousands of dollars had been solved with a part that cost less than a cup of coffee. It made for a great video moment, the kind of underdog win that built Armstrong's channel in the first place. Viewers loved it. Comment sections filled up with jokes about supercar owners paying six figures for problems anyone with a socket set could solve. There is something deeply satisfying about watching an ordinary tool humble an extraordinary machine, and Armstrong knows exactly how to frame a moment like that for the camera. But anyone who has spent real time around complex machinery knows that a blown fuse is rarely the end of a story. A fuse exists to sacrifice itself, to fail before something more expensive does. If a fuse blows, something downstream is drawing more current than it should. The question was never whether the fuse fix worked. The question was what had caused it to blow in the first place, and whether the answer would be as cheap as the fix had been. It would not be. And that single detail, the difference between a symptom and a cause, is where this story stops being a feel-good repair video and starts becoming something closer to an investigation. The fuse was a warning. To understand why the fuse blew, Armstrong's team had to go further into the Veyron than most owners ever will. The component behind the fault was the hydraulic gearbox pump, a part so critical that Bugatti reportedly replaces it as a matter of routine during annual servicing, whether or not it shows any sign of wear. That alone should tell you something about how this car is engineered. Nothing in a Veyron is allowed to age gracefully. Everything is replaced on a schedule, whether it needs it or not, because failure at this level of performance is not an inconvenience. It is a catastrophe waiting for a place to happen. What makes the discovery almost darkly funny is where that pump's design lineage traces back to. The same basic component, in a different application, is used to operate the roof mechanism on an Audi A5, a car that costs a fraction of a Veyron's price and shares almost nothing else with it. In the Veyron, though, that pump is pushed far beyond anything its humble cousin was ever asked to do. It activates every time a door opens, priming the hydraulic system and holding roughly 55 bar of pressure indefinitely if a relay sticks or the system fails to seal properly. Run that long enough, under that kind of load, and the plastic casing around the wiring begins to bake from the inside, brittle, charred, and eventually short-circuiting the very fuse designed to protect it. The fuse had not failed at random. It had failed doing its job. That is worth sitting with for a second, because it reframes the entire "fixed it with a $3 part" narrative that made the earlier video such a hit. The fuse was never the problem. It was the last line of defense in a system already under strain, and it had simply done exactly what it was designed to do, before something far more expensive gave out instead. But the gearbox pump was only the beginning. Once the Veyron was drivable again, a new symptom emerged almost immediately: a persistent misfire, localized mostly to one cylinder, but occasionally jumping across the engine's other bank. In an ordinary Volkswagen Group product, the instinct would be to swap a coil pack and move on. The Veyron does not make it that simple. Its engine uses an ion sensing system to read combustion quality directly through the spark plugs, a diagnostic layer so sophisticated that isolating a single faulty module out of a set that reportedly costs $9,000 each became its own multi-day exercise. Swap parts left to right, test, swap back, test again. Diagnosing a 16-cylinder, quad-turbocharged engine is less like fixing a car.
And while it's true that the 8-litre quad-turbo W16 engine gains 50% more power, this is way more than a tune-up job.
And more like defusing something built specifically to resist being understood by anyone outside a factory floor. And still the car had more to give up. A coolant leak surfaced next, traced with a smoke test to a pinhole in the front radiator, likely the result of a stone strike at some point in the car's life before Armstrong ever owned it. The textbook repair meant tearing apart the entire front end, wings, headlights, potentially the suspension frame, all to reach a single radiator. Instead, Armstrong's team made a call that would have purists reaching for their pearls. A stop leak sealant, run through the system until it bound at the leak point, on contact with air. Not the way Molsheim would do it, but functional, and a fraction of the labor. By this point, the pattern was unmistakable. Every fix on this car revealed another problem hiding directly behind it. Armstrong himself put it plainly at one stage of the process, joking that half the car's weight had to be made up of fluid alone, given how many separate systems it seemed to be leaking, weeping, or losing pressure from at any given moment. It was a joke, but not really. A car engineered with this much redundancy, this many interdependent systems, does not fail in single, isolated events. It fails in chains, one part masking the symptoms of another, until something finally forces the whole picture into view. And the deeper Armstrong dug, the more obvious it became that the real obstacle to fixing this Veyron was not going to be mechanical skill. It was going to be access. When Bugatti said no, every independent mechanic eventually hits the same wall with an exotic car, and it rarely has anything to do with skill. It is access. Somewhere between the misfire and the radiator, Armstrong's team decided the smart move was to simply call the manufacturer and ask to buy the parts they needed directly. It seemed reasonable. Bugatti builds the car. Bugatti presumably has the parts. Why not just pay for them like anyone else? The answer, when it came, was not a price. It was a policy. Bugatti informed Armstrong that they do not supply parts to anyone operating outside their authorized service network. If the Veyron needed factory components, the car itself would have to be brought physically on site, to be serviced entirely by the company's own technicians. Independent repair, in other words, was not simply expensive. It was structurally discouraged, built into the policy itself as something closer to a locked door than a price tag. Armstrong framed it, only half joking, as a legal loophole, a way for a manufacturer to prevent outside hands from ever touching one of its cars, regardless of who legally owns it. Whether or not that framing holds up under closer scrutiny, the practical effect was identical either way. Armstrong wasn't going to get factory parts through official channels, full stop. His own words on the matter were blunt. The customer service, he said, had not moved anywhere near as fast as the cars themselves. The team's remaining option was to fabricate or source parts themselves, piece by piece.
I'm thinking a Bugatti not going to sell us parts for it, but they might actually sell us parts, because there's no reason or no excuse on why they shouldn't sell us parts for this Veyron.
Outside the system entirely. Here is what makes this more than one YouTuber's bad luck. Armstrong was not the first person to hit this exact wall. Fellow YouTuber Mark McCann encountered a strikingly similar pattern while attempting his own Bugatti Veyron rebuild, which suggests this is not an isolated customer service failure, but something closer to a consistent policy applied across independent Veyron owners generally. One frustrated customer is an anecdote. Two, with matching experiences on the same model, starts to look like a pattern. It helps to understand who is actually setting this policy. Bugatti has not been a fully independent company for decades. It operates today under a joint venture structure alongside Rimac, with Volkswagen Group's Porsche division holding a significant stake in the business. Decisions about parts access, service networks, and pricing do not come from a small boutique atelier answering directly to customers. They come from a corporate structure with the same instincts as any other large manufacturer, protecting its service revenue and its brand image. just wrapped in the language of exclusivity and craftsmanship. This is the same fight, in miniature, that made Armstrong's Chiron project a headline story. When Bugatti locked the VIN on the crashed Chiron Pur Sport and refused to authorize part sales, it became a very public standoff, amplified by a $6 million price tag and a CEO willing to respond directly online. The Veyron situation is the exact same mechanism, quietly playing out with none of the spectacle. No viral statements, no CEO response, just a phone call, a policy, and a repair shop deciding to build what they could not buy. Right to repair fights in the automotive world usually play out over affordable, high-volume cars, the kind everyone drives, where the stakes are obvious and the sympathy is immediate. Legislation on the topic tends to get written with tractors and pickup trucks in mind, not hypercars that only a few hundred people on the planet will ever own. That framing has consequences. It is easy to rally public support behind a farmer who cannot fix his own combine harvester. It is much harder to generate the same outrage on behalf of someone who can afford a $2 million car in the first place. But that is precisely why this story matters more than it first appears to. What Armstrong's Veyron demonstrates is that the exact same battle exists at the very top of the market too, just with more zeros attached and far less attention paid. The policy Bugatti applied to a repossessed Veyron owner is not a special case invented for him. It is simply the manufacturer's standard approach to independent repair, applied consistently, regardless of who owns the car or how they came to own it. If a company can restrict who is allowed to fix a $2 million hypercar using this logic, the more interesting question is, what stops that same logic from creeping downward into cars the rest of us can actually afford? The runway breakdown. Months passed. Faults were chased down one by one, some solved with fuses and sealant, others with fabricated parts built in-house because the factory would not sell the real thing. Bodywork was refreshed. The Veyron's original light blue accents were swapped for a satin metallic silver finish, giving the car a completely different presence than the one it wore on the repossession lot. Slowly, a car that had arrived barely able to move began to look and behave like the $2 million hypercar it was always supposed to be. The final target was always going to be top speed mode, the Veyron's signature party trick, and arguably the entire reason the model became a legend in the first place. In 2010, a Veyron Super Sport set the record for the fastest production car in the world.
Super Sport, and it is seriously impressive. A luxury car and a hypercar and one of the fastest, most expensive vehicles on the planet.
A title that took years for anyone else to seriously challenge. That reputation is precisely why unlocking this mode on a car that had spent most of the last several months either broken down or apart on a workbench carried so much weight. It was not just a technical milestone. It was the moment that would prove, once and for all, whether any of the previous months of fuses, sealant, and fabricated parts had actually amounted to a real car again. Activating it is not as simple as pressing a button. It requires a dedicated key, inserted into a separate slot near the driver's seat, that physically lowers the car's ride height and locks the rear spoiler and front splitter into their most aggressive aerodynamic position. It is a mode built for one purpose only, and Bugatti does not make it easy to reach by accident. After clearing the dashboard of warning lights, fitting new wheels, and waiting out a stretch of unhelpful weather, Armstrong and his team finally loaded the Veyron onto a trailer and headed for a runway. There is a particular kind of tension that builds before a moment like this. Months of setbacks, dozens of small victories nobody outside the workshop will ever fully appreciate, all riding on whether a car that has fought back at every turn will finally cooperate when it matters most. The plan was deliberately conservative. No attempt at the car's genuine top speed of 253 miles per hour, just a shakedown run to build confidence in a car that had spent most of its recent life either broken or being fixed. Driving a rebuilt hypercar more than 100 miles on public roads, alone, to reach a private runway, is itself an act of faith in your own work. Every strange noise on that drive would have carried weight it would not have carried in an ordinary car. Every dashboard flicker becomes a question. Is this the fault finally resurfacing, or just the normal quirks of a machine this complicated? For once, the drive itself was uneventful. The car behaved. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the more reassuring stretches of road this project had produced. The homemade speed key went into the slot. It twisted. Top speed mode activated immediately, exactly as it should. For a project that had fought the manufacturer at nearly every turn just to reach this point, it was a genuine, hard-earned win. And then, after driving more than 150 miles to reach that runway without a single major issue along the way, the Veyron lost power and died. Not gradually, not with a warning light building slowly toward failure. The hypercar simply began shutting down, refusing to run properly, leaving Armstrong and his team standing on a runway with a car that had worked perfectly minutes earlier and now would not stay running long enough to diagnose. Early checks pointed toward a communication issue involving the fuel pump control module. But at that stage, the exact cause remained unclear. The video ended there, on a cliffhanger, with a team searching for answers and a hypercar that had once again found a new and completely unexpected way to fail. Bugatti's recall didn't work. What Armstrong's team traced the fault to was not a mystery part. It had a name, a part number, and a documented recall attached to it. A diagnostic scan returned a blunt message: no communication with the fuel pump control module. The team's first hope was a blown fuse, just like the gearbox pump months earlier. They checked every fuse in the engine bay. All fine.
Managed to solve the problem with just a tiny fuse.
And that fuse was for the hydraulic gearbox pump. And we all know fuses don't just end up like that on their own.
Several tests later, the real cause emerged. The module itself was sending an incorrect signal, a fault entirely internal to the part. Armstrong searched the part number and found something that turned this into an accountability story. The number matched an official recall covering 72 Bugatti Veyrons and Grand Sports affected by this exact failure. The fix called for a revised control unit, running software labeled V3.03. Armstrong checked his own car. It already had that exact revised version installed, and it had failed anyway. This was not outdated hardware nobody updated. This was the fixed version, the part Bugatti issued to resolve this exact failure, breaking the same way the original part was supposed to stop breaking. What happened next had nothing to do with engineering. Armstrong called Bugatti London. Nobody answered. He called the service center directly. Nobody answered. He called Bugatti Paris, which claims to operate Monday through Saturday. On a Monday, at midday. Nobody answered there either. To rule out bad phone lines everywhere, he called a rival manufacturer's service line instead. That call connected without issue. Then Armstrong called Bugatti's sales line. They called him back within minutes. Buying a Bugatti gets you a call back before you finish dialing. Needing one repaired, on a part the company already knows is defective, gets you silence. When Bugatti's team finally engaged, a replacement module was in stock at Molsheim, France. The price, $59,358, with the car needing to go to an official center, a process estimated at 2 weeks. Bugatti has defended pricing like this by citing the economics of hypercar scale, where specialized, low-volume parts cost far more than mass-manufactured ones. It does not explain why a part issued to fix a known recall failed exactly the way it was designed to prevent, nor why the repair line rings out while the sales line answers on the second ring. The sticker price of a hypercar was never the real cost of ownership. What Armstrong's Veyron reveals is a question of trust. If a recall fix does not fix the fault, and the line meant to help does not answer, the thing you are paying for is not engineering. It is access to a relationship that runs one direction only, toward the sale, away from everything after it. That is the story sitting quietly behind the headlines. Not a crashed hypercar and a feuding CEO. A working car, a documented recall, a fix that fixed nothing, and a company far more interested in what you're buying than in what you already own. 2 Bugattis, 2 stories, and only one made headlines. Chiron got the CEO, the viral drama, the $6 million price tag. The Veyron got a fuse, a stop leak sealant, a homemade speed key, and a recall that failed on the part meant to fix it. No public statement, no response from leadership, just an unanswered phone and a $59,000 bill for a problem already known. If a company can lock independent owners out of a $2 million hypercar, what happens when that same logic reaches the cars ordinary people actually drive? Tell us in the comments. Should manufacturers be required to support independent repairs? Subscribe for the rest of this story.